Chapter 1: The Wolves in Gilded Cages. What does it mean when an empire's greatest guardians are forced to protect a faith that the state itself refuses to fully recognize? The Teutogen Guard stand as one of the most paradoxical military institutions within the fractured edifice of the Empire of Man. These elite warriors, selected from the already formidable Knights of the White Wolf, serve as the personal bodyguard of the Ar-Ulric, the High Priest of Ulric, and an imperial elector. Yet their very existence represents a wound that has never fully healed within the Empire's political body, a reminder that unity was achieved through compromise, not conviction. Here's a question for you. When loyalty to faith conflicts with loyalty to state, which should prevail? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what city you're watching from. And if you're intrigued by the layered contradictions of Warhammer's political theology, hit that subscribe button, because we're diving deep into the cold heart of Ulric's domain. The Teutogen Guard are not merely soldiers. They are living symbols of resistance, consecrated flesh standing against centuries of institutional erosion. To understand their significance, we must first grasp what they protect, not just a man, but an entire theological worldview that the dominant cult of Sigmar has systematically marginalized. The cult of Ulric, ancient beyond the Empire itself, predates Sigmar's ascension by generations. Ulric, the god of winter, war, and wolves, demands strength without artifice, courage without gunpowder, honor forged in close combat where a warrior can see the light fade from his enemy's eyes. This is not the organized, imperial divinity of Sigmar Heldenhammer. This is primal, raw, the howl in the blizzard, the pack hunting through moonlit snow, and the Teutogen Guard embody this ethos in every scar they bear, every oath they swear over sharpened steel rather than inscribed parchment. Consider the selection process itself, a ritual that reveals the deeper theological tensions at play. Only Knights of the White Wolf who have already proven themselves in brutal martial trials can even be considered for the Teutogen Guard. These are not parade soldiers polished for state ceremonies. They are veterans who have fought beastmen in the Drakwold, faced down chaos marauders in winter campaigns where the cold itself becomes a weapon, where Ulric's blessing manifests not as divine light, but as the ability to endure when others freeze and die. When a knight is chosen to join the Teutogen Guard, it represents one of the highest honors in Ulrican tradition, an affirmation that this warrior embodies the god's uncompromising standards. Yet here lies the first paradox. This supreme honor binds them to a defensive role, to stand as guards rather than lead the offensive crusades that Ulric's warlike nature demands. They become watchdogs of a temple, protectors of a single man, when their every instinct screams to hunt, to attack, to prove their worth through conquest rather than vigilance. The equipment they carry reinforces this contradiction. The Teutogen Guard wield great weapons and wolf hammers, two-handed instruments of brutal, close-quarters slaughter. No firearms, no crossbows, nothing that creates distance between killer and killed. Ulric's hatred of gunpowder weapons is absolute, viewing such tools as cowardly artifice that robs combat of its sacred intimacy. This theological stance creates immediate friction within the Empire's military structure. While Altdorf's engineers perfect handguns and artillery, while the colleges of magic weave destructive spells, the Teutogen Guard remain steadfast in their rejection of such innovations. They train in a martial tradition that is, by the standards of modern imperial warfare, obsolescent. Yet they persist, because to adopt firearms would be to betray the very essence of Ulric, to admit that strength alone is insufficient, that courage requires augmentation, that the old ways have failed. And for the Teutogen Guard, such admission is unthinkable. They would rather die in anachronistic glory than survive through what they perceive as cowardly adaptation. This brings us to the political dimension of their existence, the hidden battleground where theology becomes power. The Ar-Ulric, whom the Teutogen Guard protect, is an imperial elector, possessing a vote in the selection of the emperor himself. This is no ceremonial position. When emperors are crowned, the Ar-Ulric's support or opposition can determine the fate of dynasties. Yet this political power exists in constant tension with religious conviction. Many within the cult of Ulric, including, whisper suggests, members of the Teutogen Guard themselves, harbor beliefs that directly challenge the Empire's foundational mythology. The so-called Sigmarian heresy, officially condemned by the Concordat of Nuln in 2004 imperial calendar, held that Sigmar was never a true god, merely a great mortal whose achievements were magnified by Ulric's blessing. According to this suppressed doctrine, the priests of Sigmar are either deluded fools or knowing deceivers, their miracles, the work of daemons masquerading as divine favor. Though formerly outlawed for centuries, this belief persists in the shadows of Ulrican orthodoxy, a theological time bomb that could shatter the Empire's fragile religious consensus if it ever detonated into open conflict. Imagine the psychological burden this places on the Teutogen Guard. They stand beside the Ar-Ulric at state functions where the Grand Theogonist of Sigmar presides with equal authority. They witness their lord offer diplomatic courtesies to priests whose very existence their deepest beliefs condemn as fraudulent or worse. They watch Sigmarite propaganda elevate a mortal man to godhood, while their ancient deity, who guarded humanity through the Age of Ice before Sigmar was even born, receives secondary honor in his own empire. The rage this must generate, cold, controlled but never extinguished, simmers beneath every formal vow, every forced alliance. The Teutogen Guard are warriors trained to kill, yet they must constantly restrain that capacity, must perform civility while every fiber of their Ulrican conditioning screams that such weakness is contemptible. They are wolves forced to smile at the shepherds who have claimed their territory. The city of Middenheim itself embodies this tension in architectural form. Built atop the Ulricsberg, a massive plateau of sheer rock rising from the northern forests, Middenheim is a natural fortress where Ulric's presence feels almost physical. The cold wind that never ceases, the sacred flame that burns without fuel in the god's temple. Unlike Altdorf with its rivers of commerce and diplomatic concession, Middenheim maintains a harsh, martial character. The Elector Count Boris Todbringer rules here, but his power is constantly negotiated with the Ar-Ulric, whose control over the faithful gives him authority that transcends mere politics. The Teutogen Guard patrol this city, knowing it is one of the few places in the Empire where Ulric still commands primary devotion, where the temples of Sigmar are visitors in another god's domain. Yet even here, they cannot escape the broader reality. Middenheim is a provincial power, and Altdorf sets the Empire's direction. The cult of Sigmar's dominance is not a matter of theology, but of institutional power control over the Emperor's legitimacy, over the majority of the Empire's provinces, over the narrative of what the Empire means and who deserves glory. This generates a tragic irony that defines the Teutogen Guard's existence. They are elite warriors sworn to protect ancient traditions, yet those very traditions are slowly suffocating under the weight of political pragmatism. Every year, more of the Empire's nobility send their sons to become Knights of Sigmar's Griffon rather than Knights of the White Wolf. Every generation, fewer young warriors choose the harsh discipline of Ulrican training when Sigmarite orders offer better political connections, better lands, better prospects for advancement. The Teutogen Guard represent the pinnacle of a martial tradition that is, gradually and inexorably, losing the cultural war for the Empire's soul. They are magnificent, they are fierce, they are doomed not by any external enemy, but by the slow erosion of relevance. Their swords are sharp, but they cannot cut through demographic decline, institutional marginalization, or the simple human calculation that betting on Sigmar offers better odds than betting on Ulric. Yet they endure. This is crucial to understand. The Teutogen Guard have not collapsed into despair or abandoned their posts. They continue their training, continue their vigil, continue to embody standards that much of the Empire now views as fanatical or archaic. There is a profound stubbornness in this, a refusal to accept that might does not make right, that numbers do not determine truth, that political power supersedes divine will. In the quiet hours of their watch, standing in the cold halls of the Temple of Ulric, what do they think about? Do they imagine a future where Ulric's worship returns to primacy, where the Empire remembers its true strength came from winter's endurance rather than summer's? Expansion? Or do they know, in the part of the heart that speaks only truth, that they are preserving something beautiful that is already dead, maintaining the forms of a faith that history has passed by? This question haunts not just the Teutogen Guard, but the entire Ulrican tradition. If your god demands strength above all else, what does it mean when your cult grows progressively weaker in numbers, influence, and political power? Does this suggest Ulric's disfavor, or does it prove that strength alone cannot win institutional battles that require compromise? Diplomacy and the accumulation of soft power. The Teutogen Guard cannot answer this with their swords. They can only continue standing watch, these magnificent anachronisms, guarding a flame that illuminates less and less of the Empire with each passing winter. The tragedy is not that they fail at their duty. The tragedy is that their success is ultimately irrelevant to the larger forces reshaping the empire around them, forces they can neither fight nor join without betraying everything that gives their existence meaning. But this raises another question, one that will shadow our entire exploration. What happens when an institution built on unwavering principle confronts a political reality that demands constant adaptation? The Teutogen Guard's dilemma is not unique to them, it is the Empire's. Dilemma, writ small, the fundamental tension between ideological purity and practical survival that has driven much of the Old World's bloodiest conflicts. Chapter 2, The Architecture of Decline. The question we ended with demands examination, not in abstract terms, but through the blood and failure of specific moments when principle collided with reality and neither emerged intact. The Teutogen Guard story is not one of sudden catastrophe, but of gradual diminishment, a death by 1,000 compromises that they themselves never made, but which nonetheless consumed the world around them. To understand how an elite warrior order becomes politically irrelevant despite maintaining martial excellence, we must trace the architectural failures of Ulrican power, the specific structural weaknesses that no amount of individual courage could overcome. This is where lore becomes painful, where the details reveal a machinery of decline that was perhaps inevitable from the moment Sigmar unified the tribes under a banner that was never truly Ulric's. Before we descend further into this analysis, let me ask you this. Have you ever fought for something you knew was already lost, simply because abandoning it would mean betraying who you are? That's the Teutogen Guard's entire existence distilled to a single question. If you've experienced that kind of loyalty, or witnessed it in others, share your story in the comments. I read everyone, and these discussions help us understand why fictional lore resonates with real human experience. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the next chapters will explore even darker implications of institutional decay. The first concrete example we must examine is the aftermath of the Great War against Chaos in 2002 Imperial calendar, specifically the political maneuvering around Magnus the Pious and the solidification of Sigmarite supremacy. Magnus, who would become Emperor Magnus I, united the fractured empire against the Chaos invasion led by Ar-Ulric. This was humanity's darkest hour, when daemons walked openly in the material world and entire provinces burned. The cult of Ulric fought with ferocious distinction in this war. The Knights of the White Wolf were instrumental in numerous battles, their rejection of gunpowder proving less of a handicap against demonic foes who cared nothing for bullets anyway. The Teutogen Guard themselves, though primarily protective of the Ar-Ulric, would have been present in any engagement where their lord's life was threatened. They survived that apocalypse. They helped save the empire. And their reward was institutional marginalization. Here is where surface observation gives way to hidden motivation. Magnus the Pious was proclaimed emperor by acclamation, his rise to power legitimized by the grand theogonist of Sigmar, who crowned him amid prophecies of divine favor. The narrative that emerged from the Great War was fundamentally Sigmarite. Sigmar had watched over his empire, had sent a champion in its hour of need, had proven through miraculous victory that he remained the empire's true protector. This narrative was not entirely false. Magnus was genuinely inspired, genuinely capable, genuinely the right leader at the right moment. But the political implications were profound and deliberately constructed. By framing the victory as Sigmar's triumph, the cult of Sigmar positioned itself as the essential religious foundation of imperial unity. Any challenge to Sigmarite supremacy could now be painted as not merely theological disagreement, but as dangerous sedition that threatened the very unity that had saved humanity. The cult of Ulric found itself in an impossible position. They had fought just as hard, suffered just as greatly, demonstrated just as much courage, but they lacked the institutional apparatus to control the narrative. The Sigmarite Church possessed printing presses, literacy networks, connections to every major noble house in the southern and central provinces. They could commission artworks, fund bards, establish schools that taught imperial history from a Sigmarite perspective. The cult of Ulric, by contrast, remained concentrated primarily in Middenland and Nordland, their martial culture emphasizing deed over word, their theology suspicious of elaborate institutional machinery. They could not compete in the war of stories, and in politics, the story often matters more than the truth. The Teutogen Guard embody this tragic disconnect between martial excellence and political impotence. Consider what their training emphasizes: physical prowess, weapon mastery, tactical discipline, unwavering loyalty to the Ar-Ulric. These are magnificent qualities for warriors. They are utterly insufficient for navigating the complex web of patronage, propaganda, and institutional alliance, building that determines power in the Empire's political structure. A Teutogen Guard can kill 10 men in single combat. But he cannot persuade a wavering elector count that Ulrican theology deserves equal institutional support to Sigmarite doctrine. He cannot negotiate favorable trade agreements that would enrich Middenheim relative to Altdorf. He cannot draft legal arguments defending the cult of Ulric's privileges against encroachment by imperial law increasingly written by Sigmarite-educated bureaucrats. His strength is irrelevant to the battles actually being fought for the Empire's future. This generates the second layer of tragedy, cosmic consequence emerging from individual limitation. Every year that passes sees the Empire's center of gravity shift further toward Altdorf and Sigmarite cultural dominance. The Teutogen Guard remain exactly as capable as they were a century ago. The institution has not degraded in quality. The warriors are just as fierce, just as skilled, just as devoted. Yet they matter less with each passing decade, not because they have failed, but because the criteria for mattering have changed beneath their feet. Political power in the late Empire is not determined by who has the finest warriors, but by who controls succession, who influences the colleges of magic, who dominates international trade, who possesses the administrative capacity to tax efficiently and deploy resources rapidly. The Teutogen Guard excel at none of these things because they were never designed to excel at them. They are master craftsmen whose entire skill set has become obsolescent through no fault of their own. Let us examine a specific individual to make this concrete, Ar-Ulric Emil Valgaer, who served during the early 2400s imperial calendar. Valgaer was by all accounts a man of unimpeachable Ulrican virtue, personally courageous, theologically orthodox, uninterested in political maneuvering or personal enrichment. His Teutogen Guard revered him because he embodied every quality their god demanded. He would personally join them in combat training, would accept no comfort his warriors did not share, would enforce the harsh disciplines of Ulrican worship without exception or excuse. He was, in many ways, the perfect Ar-Ulric from a theological perspective, and his tenure was a political disaster for the cult of Ulric precisely because of these virtues. Valgaer's refusal to engage in corrupt political negotiations meant that when imperial law was being codified during this period, Ulrican concerns went unrepresented at critical moments. When disputes arose between Middenheim and neighboring provinces, Valgaer would not compromise Ulrican principles to achieve favorable settlements, resulting in losses of territory and commercial rights that weakened Middenheim's economic base. When opportunities arose to place Ulrican candidates in positions of imperial bureaucracy, Valgaer refused to engage in the patronage systems necessary to secure such appointments, viewing them as debasing to Ulric's honor. His Teutogen Guard watched their lord behave with impeccable integrity, while the institutional power of their cult crumbled around them. What could they do? Their duty was to protect his physical person, not to override his political decisions. They stood guard while the temple burned politically, unable to save what mattered most because it was not threatened by enemies they could fight with steel. The philosophical implication here cuts to the bone. Can virtue itself become a form of self-destruction when practiced without regard for context? Ulric demands strength, courage, honesty, straightforward action. These are good qualities in warriors. But they create leaders who are systematically disadvantaged in environments that reward patience, indirection, strategic dishonesty, and the willingness to accept temporary dishonor for long-term advantage. The Sigmarite Church understood this. Their theology of defending civilization provided justification for any expedient action that strengthened the Empire's institutional stability. They could be pragmatic without feeling they betrayed their god. The Ulricans, locked into a theology of uncompromising strength, had no such flexibility. Every compromise felt like betrayal. So they made fewer compromises, and they lost, slowly but inexorably, every institutional battle that mattered. The Teutogen Guard's weapons themselves become metaphorical in this context. The great hammers they wield, masterworks of combat engineering, perfectly balanced instruments of devastating power, are designed to smash through armor, to break bodies, to solve problems through overwhelming physical force. But you cannot hammer a political movement into submission. You cannot smash diplomacy or shatter a legal framework with physical strength. The tools that make the Teutogen Guard supreme in their chosen domain are completely useless in the domains that actually determine the cult of Ulric's fate. They are armed to perfection for the wrong war, and their very excellence in combat blinds them to how thoroughly they are losing the conflict that matters. Consider also the geographic dimension of their decline. Middenheim, for all its impressive fortifications and natural defensibility, is ultimately a provincial capital. It controls the Dracwald region and exerts influence over northern trade routes, but it lacks the sheer commercial dynamism of Altdorf with its river connections to Marienburg and the lucrative Reichland territories. The Teutogen Guard patrol a city that is strategically important but economically secondary. Every talented young warrior who chooses Altdorf over Middenheim, every merchant who establishes his primary warehouse in the capital, rather than in Ulric city, every noble family that sends their children to receive education from Sigmarite institutions rather than Ulrican temples. Each of these small decisions compounds into a demographic catastrophe. The Teutogen Guard cannot prevent this erosion because it happens through the accumulation of individual choices made for rational economic and political reasons. There is a particular cruelty in this form of defeat. If the cult of Ulric was being actively persecuted, if Sigmarite inquisitors were burning Ulrican temples or executing priests, the Teutogen Guard would know exactly what to do. They would fight. They would die gloriously in defense of their faith, and their martyrdom would mean something, would inspire others, would fit perfectly into Ulric's theology of honorable struggle. But that is not what is happening. The cult of Sigmar does not need to persecute the cult of Ulric. They simply need to ensure that Sigmarite institutions offer better opportunities, that imperial law gradually favors Sigmarite interpretations, that the machinery of state functions more smoothly for those who align with the dominant religious culture. The Teutogen Guard face not an enemy they can fight, but a system they cannot even meaningfully oppose without abandoning the very principles that define their existence. This brings us to perhaps the deepest irony. The Teutogen Guard's perfection as Ulrican warriors makes them incapable of saving Ulrican power. If they were more flexible, more willing to adapt, more capable of political thinking, they might be able to help their cult navigate the changing empire. But such qualities would make them less perfect as embodiments of Ulric's uncompromising ethos. They are trapped in a theological catch-22. To succeed in the modern empire, they would need to become something that Ulric would not recognize as worthy. To remain worthy of Ulric, they must continue practices that guarantee their political marginalization. There is no synthesis, no middle path that preserves both theological integrity and political relevance. They can be true to their god or effective in the world, but the structure of the situation prevents them from being both simultaneously. The Teutogen Guard understand this on some level. In the quiet moments between duties, in the long winter night standing watch in Middenheim's cold halls, they must feel the weight of this impossible situation. They have done everything right by Ulrican standards. They have maintained their skills, upheld their oaths, protected their lord, embodied the virtues their theology demands. And it has not been enough. It will never be enough, because the game changed and no one asked them if they consented to the new rules. Their entire existence has become a beautiful futility, magnificent warriors standing guard over a declining institution, unable to arrest that decline through the only means they possess. Yet they continue. This is what makes them tragic rather than merely pathetic. They know, or at least sense, that their position is untenable, but they continue anyway, because to abandon their posts would be to admit that strength is not enough, that honor cannot triumph, that Ulric's way has been proven insufficient by history. Such admission is psychologically impossible for them. So they persist in their vigil, these doomed warriors, maintaining standards that the world has decided are archaic while they wait for enemies who never come, because the real enemy is not something you can kill with a hammer. It is time itself. It is cultural evolution. It is the simple mathematics of demography and economy. And against these foes, even the Teutogen Guard's vaunted strength means nothing at all. But if the Teutogen Guard cannot save the cult of Ulric through strength, does this mean salvation is impossible, or merely that it requires tools and methods that Ulric himself would reject as dishonorable? Chapter 3: The Heresy of Survival. The question of salvation through compromise brings us to the most psychologically devastating aspect of the Teutogen Guard's existence, the moments when they witnessed their own cult make exactly such compromises, and had to decide whether to condemn or understand these betrayals of principle. Because the cult of Ulric has not been passive in its decline. Throughout the centuries of gradual marginalization, various factions within the faith have proposed solutions, reforms, adaptations that might arrest the institutional hemorrhaging. And the Teutogen Guard, sworn to protect the Ar-Ulric regardless of his decisions, have had to stand watch while their leaders chose between purity and pragmatism, knowing that either choice leads to a different form of death. This is where theology becomes anguish, where doctrine transforms into lived suffering that no amount of martial training can prepare a warrior to endure. Let me pause here with a question that goes beyond Warhammer lore and touches something universal. When the institution you serve begins changing to survive, at what point does it stop being the thing you originally pledged your life to defend? This is not abstract philosophy. For the Teutogen Guard, it is the daily reality of their service. Drop your thoughts below, especially if you have ever worked in an organization that had to choose between its founding principles and its continued existence. These parallels between fantasy and reality are what make lore analysis meaningful. And if this exploration resonates with you, make sure you are subscribed, because the final chapter will bring all these threads together into a revelation about what the Teutogen Guard story ultimately means for the Empire's future. The most significant example of this internal conflict erupts around the figure of Ar-Ulric Werner Krieglitz, who held the position during the mid-2400s imperial calendar. Krieglitz represented a new breed of Ulrican leadership, pragmatic, politically sophisticated, willing to engage with the Empire's power structures on their own terms. Unlike his predecessor Valgeir, Krieglitz understood that theological purity meant nothing if the cult lacked the resources and influence to actually practice its faith. He began making calculated compromises. He accepted imperial subsidies that came with strings attached, requiring Ulrican temples to teach literacy using texts approved by Sigmarite censors. He negotiated agreements that gave Middenheim better trade terms in exchange for Ulrican support of Sigmarite candidates in certain electoral disputes. He even, most controversially, softened the cult's official position on the Sigmarian heresy, not endorsing it, but ceasing to actively preach it, allowing the theological wound to scar over rather than constantly reopening it. The Teutogen Guard watching this transformation faced an impossible psychological burden. On one hand, Krieglitz's reforms were working by measurable standards. Ulrican temples received funding for repairs that had been deferred for decades. Young initiates from poorer families could now afford to complete their training, bolstering recruitment numbers that had been steadily declining. Middenheim's economic position improved, allowing the city to maintain its military strength and resist further encroachment on its political autonomy. From a purely practical standpoint, Krieglitz was succeeding where his more orthodox predecessors had failed. He was saving the institutional body of the cult of Ulric through strategic adaptation. But at what cost to its soul? This question haunted every warrior of the Teutogen Guard who still believed in the harsh, uncompromising Ulric of ancient tradition. The god they worshipped demanded strength without artifice, honor without calculation, warfare conducted face-to-face where courage could be witnessed and cowardice could not hide. Krieglitz's diplomacy, his strategic retreats, his willingness to smile at Sigmarite officials he privately despised, all of this felt like betrayal to the purists within the Guard. They had sworn to protect the Ar-Ulric's person, yes, but they had also sworn deeper oaths to Ulric himself. When those two loyalties came into conflict, when protecting the man meant watching him debase the office, what was a Teutogen Guard supposed to do? Some chose silent disapproval, maintaining their external discipline while allowing their internal contempt to fester. Others sought transfers to other Ulrican orders, where they could avoid witnessing the compromises up close. A few, very few, but their existence is documented in fragmentary sources, apparently approached other members of the Ulrican hierarchy to discuss whether Krieglitz's reforms constituted heresy serious enough to warrant his removal. This was extraordinarily dangerous ground. The Teutogen Guard are not a political force in their own right. They have no constitutional authority beyond their protective function. For them to even contemplate acting against their lord would violate the foundational oath of their order. Yet the alternative, standing by while everything they believed was systematically dismantled, seemed equally unbearable. The cosmic consequence of this internal division was that it paralyzed the Teutogen Guard at exactly the moment when unified, decisive action might have mattered. While they debated theology and loyalty in their barracks, while they wrestled with questions that had no satisfying answers, the broader political landscape continued evolving in directions unfavorable to Ulrican interests. The opportunity cost of their internal conflict was measured in missed alliances, abandoned strategies, and gradual erosion of whatever leverage Middenheim still possessed. The Teutogen Guard's very excellence, their deep commitment to principle, their unwillingness to casually abandon sacred oaths, became a source of institutional sclerosis. They were so concerned with doing the right thing that they became incapable of doing anything at all. Consider the psychological profile of a warrior trapped in this situation. Let us imagine a specific Teutogen Guard, we will call him Ludovic, a veteran of 20 years' service, a man who has killed beastmen and chaos marauders, who has stood watch through blizzards that would kill lesser men, who has never once questioned his vocation until now. Ludovic was trained by mentors who told him stories of ancient Ulric, the god who tested the Teutogen tribe with winter's cruelty, who blessed only those strong enough to survive without begging for mercy, who promised nothing except that strength would be recognized and weakness would be punished. This theology made sense to Ludovic. It felt true in his bones, validated by every scar he earned in honest combat. Now Ludovic stands guard while Ar-Ulric Krieglitz meets with Sigmarite officials, watches his lord offer diplomatic courtesies to priests whose theology implicitly declares Ulric a secondary deity. He hears Krieglitz make jokes, sees him share wine, witnesses the careful construction of relationships built on mutual interest rather than shared conviction. And Ludovic understands intellectually why this is happening. He is not stupid. He knows the cult needs resources, needs political protection, needs to navigate a hostile environment dominated by Sigmarite power. But understanding does not ease the anguish. Because if Ulric truly values strength above all else, what does it mean that his worshippers must bow and scrape to survive? Does this not prove by Ulric's own standards that the cult has grown weak? And if the cult is weak, does it deserve to survive, or would Ulric prefer that it die rather than persist through dishonorable compromise? These are the thoughts that poison Ludovic's mind as he stands watch. Not thoughts of personal safety. He would die for Ulric without hesitation if an enemy appeared he could fight with steel. But these enemies are abstract, systemic, impossible to confront with the tools he possesses. His great hammer, the weapon he has trained with since youth, the instrument through which he channels Ulric's blessing, is utterly useless against the problems that are actually killing his faith. He is magnificently armed for the wrong battle, and he knows it, and the knowledge eats at him like acid on iron, corroding his sense of purpose from within. The Teutogen Guard's crisis is compounded by their isolation from broader Ulrican society. They are elite warriors, but this very elitism separates them from the ordinary believers who might offer different perspectives. The common Ulrican worshipper in Middenheim, a blacksmith perhaps, or a merchant, or a soldier in the city guard, faces these theological dilemmas differently. For them, faith is one aspect of life alongside family obligations, economic necessities, social relationships. They can compartmentalize more easily, can accept that religious ideals must sometimes bend to practical realities without experiencing it as existential crisis. But the Teutogen Guard have no such psychological distance. Their entire identity is constructed around Ulrican service. They have no families, no business interests, no social lives outside the order. If Ulric's way fails, they fail. If the cult's theology proves inadequate to the modern world, then they themselves are inadequate. The stakes could not be more personal. This generates a particular form of resentment toward those Ulricans who adapt more easily to the changing religious landscape. The Teutogen Guard look at Knights of the White Wolf who privately maintain Ulrican devotion while publicly participating in imperial ceremonies that honor Sigmar equally, and they see cowardice. They observe Ulrican priests who soften the harsh edges of their theology to make it more palatable to potential converts, and they see corruption. They watch Middenheim's nobility send their children to be educated in Eichtdorf where Sigmarite worldviews dominate, and they see betrayal. But underneath the judgment is fear. Fear that perhaps these adaptable Ulricans are right, that rigidity leads only to extinction, that the Teutogen Guard themselves are clinging to a version of their faith that history has already condemned to irrelevance. The philosophical implication reaches toward the tragic core of conservative religious movements facing modernity. The Teutogen Guard represent theological conservatism in its purest form, the belief that eternal truths should not bend to temporary circumstances, that principles matter more than consequences, that maintaining sacred tradition is worth any material cost. This is not an unreasonable position. If religious beliefs change whenever they become inconvenient, in what sense are they beliefs rather than merely preferences? If Ulric's commandments can be negotiated away for political advantage, what differentiates Ulrican worship from simple tribalism with a divine label attached? The Teutogen Guard's rigidity comes from genuine theological seriousness, from taking their god's nature as something real and non-negotiable rather than as a flexible metaphor that can be reinterpreted to suit contemporary needs. Yet this very seriousness becomes self-destructive when the world changes in ways that make traditional practice untenable. Ulric's prohibition on gunpowder weapons made perfect sense in an era when warfare was primarily melee combat and individual courage was the decisive factor. But the empire of the 2500s imperial calendar fights with handguns, with cannons, with coordinated pike formations supported by artillery. A Teutogen Guard charging into such firepower with only his great hammer is not demonstrating courage. He is committing suicide through tactical obsolescence. His faithfulness to Ulric's ancient commandments does not make him a better warrior, it makes him a corpse. And yet abandoning the prohibition would mean admitting that Ulric's wisdom was contextual rather than absolute, that the god either did not foresee future developments or did not care about his followers' survival in changed circumstances. Either implication is theologically devastating. The Teutogen Guard thus find themselves defending not merely a religious institution but an entire worldview that modernity has rendered questionable. They believe that individual strength and courage should determine outcomes, that honor matters more than efficiency, that there are things more important than survival. These beliefs are beautiful in their own way, representing values that speak to something deep in human nature. The desire for life to have meaning beyond mere continuation, for actions to matter in some absolute sense rather than being judged purely by pragmatic results. But the empire's evolution suggests that such values cannot compete with institutions built on pragmatism, efficiency, and strategic amorality. The Sigmarite Church succeeds not because Sigmar is truly superior to Ulric, but because Sigmarite theology permits the kinds of compromises and adaptations necessary for institutional survival in a complex political environment. This leads to a question the Teutogen Guard cannot openly ask, but which lurks beneath every other doubt. What if Ulric is wrong? Not wrong in the sense of not existing, but wrong in his commandments, wrong in his expectations, wrong in his vision of what makes a life or a faith worth preserving? If strength and courage are insufficient to protect the things that matter, if honor becomes a liability rather than an asset, if winter's harsh purity cannot survive in a world that has invented central heating, metaphorically speaking, then perhaps Ulric's way was always doomed. Perhaps the god's vision was noble but impractical, a beautiful ideal that could never survive contact with the messy realities of human politics and historical change. To even think such thoughts feels like heresy. Yet how can the Teutogen Guard avoid them when the evidence surrounds them constantly, when every day brings fresh confirmation that Ulric's path leads nowhere but toward dignified extinction? The emotional toll this takes on. Individual warriors must be extraordinary. Imagine maintaining combat readiness, maintaining discipline, maintaining the public facade of unwavering faith, while these doubts gnaw your psyche. Imagine standing beside brothers in arms who might harbor completely different conclusions about the same theological crisis. Some believing Krieglitz is saving the faith, others believing he is destroying it, still others paralyzed by uncertainty. The Teutogen Guard cannot openly discuss these divisions without risking the unit cohesion that their protective function demands, so they perform unity while fragmenting internally, each warrior isolated in his private theological hell, unable to resolve questions that would challenge the finest theologians of the age, and through it all they continue their duties. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their tragedy. Not that they despair, but that they persist despite despair. The Teutogen Guard still train with fanatical dedication, still maintain their combat readiness, still stand watch over the Ar-Ulric with vigilance that never wavers, regardless of their private doubts about his decisions. This is discipline of the highest order, the ability to continue functioning even when the purpose of your function has become uncertain. It represents a form of strength that Ulric himself might not recognize. Not the strength to fight, but the strength to endure. Meaninglessness, to fulfill oaths even when you suspect those oaths bind you to a losing cause, to maintain standards when the world has stopped caring whether you meet them or not. But this raises the final, most devastating question. If the Teutogen Guard have become this, warriors who persist despite doubting their purpose, who maintain traditions they suspect are futile, who serve a god who may have abandoned them to historical inevitability, then what exactly are they guarding anymore? The Ar-Ulric's body can be protected with steel, but what about the faith itself, the living tradition they supposedly embody? can that be protected by warriors whose own hearts are battlegrounds of theological civil war? Chapter 4. Guardians of the Absent God. The question of what the Teutogen Guard actually protect when the faith itself fragments brings us to the deepest layer of this lore, the revelation that transforms their story from mere institutional decline into something approaching tragic grandeur. Because here is the truth that the previous chapters have been circling: the Teutogen Guard have become, perhaps without fully realizing it, the last genuine repository of Ulrican values in a cult that has increasingly abandoned those values to survive. They are not guarding the cult of Ulric as it exists. They are guarding the memory of what it once was, and perhaps the possibility of what it might become again if circumstances ever permit the return of genuine Ulrican practice. They are wardens of an ideal that their own church no longer fully believes in, protectors of a flame that illuminates nothing except their own devotion, and this, paradoxically, is what makes them matter. Before we reach the final implications, let me ask you one last time to engage with this analysis. What institutions in your own life, religious, political, cultural, persist, not because they are thriving, but because someone somewhere refuses to let them die? The Teutogen Guard's story is ultimately about that kind of stubborn, possibly futile, possibly essential resistance to entropy. Share your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations extend the lore beyond mere entertainment into genuine philosophical territory. And if you have found value in this deep exploration, please subscribe and consider sharing this video with others who appreciate lore analysis that refuses to accept surface-level interpretations. To understand what the Teutogen Guard have become, we must first examine what they were meant to be at their founding. The order was established in antiquity, likely predating even the formation of the empire, as the personal protectors of the Ar-Ulric when that position held undisputed primacy among the northern tribes. In that original context, the Teutogen Guard were not merely bodyguards but sacred warriors who embodied Ulric's martial ideal: strength without dishonor, courage without calculation, loyalty unto death. Their role was partly ceremonial, yes, but the ceremony mattered because it reinforced a living theology that the entire community shared and practiced. When a young warrior joined the Teutogen Guard in those ancient days, he was entering a tradition that represented the pinnacle of his culture's values, the ultimate expression of everything his society honored and aspired to become. Fast forward to the 2000s imperial calendar, and that cultural context has evaporated. The Teutogen Guard still exist. They still train with the same intensity, they still maintain the same standards, but the society around them has moved on. The average citizen of Middenheim in this era is more likely to venerate Sigmar alongside Ulric, to see the old prohibitions on gunpowder as archaic rather than sacred, to value commercial success and political stability over the harsh purity of ancient warrior traditions. The Teutogen Guard have not changed, but they now exist in a culture that no longer fully understands what they represent. They are living anachronisms, performers in a ritual whose original meaning has been forgotten by most of the audience, yet they persist. And here is where we begin to glimpse the deeper significance of their persistence. Consider what happens to sacred traditions when they lose their institutional support and mass adherence. In most cases, they simply vanish. The practices stop, the knowledge dies with the last practitioners, the living connection to the past is severed. But sometimes, a small group of devotees maintains the tradition with fanatical precision precisely because it is endangered. The Teutogen Guard have become that small group for authentic Ulrican practice. They cannot save the broader cult from its compromises and adaptations. But they can, through their own unwavering adherence to ancient standards, preserve a living example of what Ulrican worship actually demands when practiced without dilution or excuse. This transforms their apparent futility into a different kind of significance. The Teutogen Guard are not effective political actors. They cannot reverse the cult of Ulric's institutional decline, but they can serve as a permanent rebuke to that decline, a standing reminder that the compromises made for survival are still compromises. That's something. Authentic has been lost, even if the loss was necessary. Every time a reformed Ulrican priest sees a Teutogen Guard training in the ancient style, refusing gunpowder weapons, maintaining disciplines that most of the cult has abandoned as impractical, that priest is confronted with the question of what exactly has been gained through all the pragmatic adaptations. Material resources, yes, political protection, certainly, but at the cost of becoming something that ancient Ulric might not even recognize as his own faith. Let us examine a specific scenario to make this concrete. Imagine a critical moment during the reign of Emperor Karl Franz in the early 2500s, when tensions between Middenheim and Altdorf reached a particularly dangerous level over succession politics and economic disputes. The Ar-Ulric of this period faces immense pressure to offer full public support for Karl Franz's policies in exchange for imperial concessions on trade rights and military support against potential northern invasions. The political calculus is clear: support the emperor, receive tangible benefits that strengthen Middenheim's position, oppose him or remain neutral, risk isolation and potential economic strangulation. Every advisor in the Ar-Ulric's council urges compromise, urges the pragmatic choice. And the Teutogen Guard stand watch during these deliberations. They say nothing. It is not their place to speak on political matters, but their presence speaks volumes. These warriors represent a version of Ulrican faith that would never bend knee to political pressure, that would rather suffer material loss than compromise sacred principle. They do not need to argue the point. Their very existence, their continued adherence to standards everyone else has abandoned, makes the argument for them. The Ar-Ulric looks at them and must confront the question: what would the god I claim to serve actually want in this situation? Not what is politically expedient, not what preserves institutional power, but what would Ulric, the god of strength and honor, who despises cowardice and calculation, actually demand of his high priest? The Teutogen Guard cannot force the Ar-Ulric to choose honor over pragmatism. They have no such authority. But they can make it impossible for him to choose pragmatism while pretending it is the honorable choice. They are witnesses, and their witnessing matters because it prevents complete moral collapse into pure expedience. As long as the Teutogen Guard exist and maintain their ancient standards, the cult of Ulric retains some connection to its theological roots, some thread linking the compromised present to the uncompromising past. If they were to disappear or abandon their peculiar disciplines, that final link would sever and the cult would become merely another political institution wearing religious costuming. This brings us to the Epiphany, the moment when all the fragments of this analysis suddenly cohere into a unified truth. The Teutogen Guard matter not despite their political irrelevance, but because of it. Their very uselessness in the Empire's power struggles is what allows them to preserve something that cannot survive within those power struggles. If they were politically effective, they would need to make the same compromises that have corrupted the broader Ulrican institution. If they wielded significant power, they would need to use that power strategically, which would require the same expedient amorality that characterizes successful imperial politics. Their marginalization is precisely what permits them to remain pure, to continue embodying Ulric's uncompromising ethos without being forced to bend it to practical necessity. They are guardians not of power, but of principle. And in a world where power increasingly requires the abandonment of principle, someone must guard the principles that power cannot afford to maintain. The Teutogen Guard fulfill this function for Ulrican theology. They are the keepers of the hard truths, that courage matters, that honor exists, that strength without integrity is merely brutality, that some things are worth dying for, even when dying accomplishes nothing practical. These truths cannot survive in environments dominated by political calculation and strategic compromise, but they can survive in a small warrior order that asks nothing of the world except the right to continue practicing what they believe, regardless of whether anyone else values that practice. Consider the psychological transformation this implies for individual Teutogen Guards as they mature in service. A young initiate joins the order believing he will be a hero, will defend the faith against external enemies, will demonstrate Ulric's supremacy through glorious combat. Years pass. He realizes the real threats to his faith are not enemies he can fight, but systemic forces he can barely comprehend. He witnesses his cult making compromises that feel like betrayals. He stands guard over leaders whose decisions he privately questions. And gradually, if he does not break under the strain, he comes to understand a different kind of heroism. Not the heroism of achieving great victories, but the heroism of maintaining standards when maintaining them serves no obvious purpose except that the standards themselves matter. This is existential heroism of the highest order. The young warrior imagined he would die gloriously in battle, his sacrifice meaning something obvious and immediate. The mature Teutogen Guard realizes his sacrifice is much stranger. The sacrifice of living a disciplined life in service to ideals the world has rejected, of maintaining readiness for battles that will probably never come, of being excellent at things that no longer matter in any practical sense. This requires a form of courage that Ulric's ancient theology might not have anticipated. Not the courage to face death, but the courage to face meaninglessness, to continue acting as if your actions matter even when all evidence suggests they do not. Yet there is a profound paradox embedded in this situation. The Teutogen Guard's actions do matter, just not in ways that can be measured by conventional metrics of success. Every day they maintain their disciplines, they prove that it is possible to resist historical inevitability, to refuse to adapt when adaptation requires betraying core values. This proof may seem useless in the moment, but history is long and circumstances change in unpredictable ways. There may come a time perhaps during some future crisis when the Empire's pragmatic compromises fail catastrophically, when the memory preserved by the Teutogen Guard becomes desperately relevant, when people look for examples of authentic virtue and find only this small warrior order still practicing what everyone else abandoned. Imagine a scenario several generations hence, after the Empire has suffered devastating defeats because its armies, for all their technological sophistication, lack the unbreakable morale and individual courage that once characterized Imperial warriors. Imagine that in this crisis, someone remembers the Teutogen Guard, remembers that there were warriors who maintained the old ways, who proved that modern humans are still capable of the kind of disciplined ferocity that built the Empire in the first place. Suddenly, what appeared to be useless anachronism becomes invaluable cultural reservoir. The Teutogen Guard's preservation of ancient martial traditions stops being a curiosity and becomes a potential template for renewal, a proof that what was lost can be recovered because it was never completely lost. It was being guarded, carefully maintained by warriors the pragmatists had written off as irrelevant. This is speculative, of course. The Teutogen Guard may guard their traditions for centuries more without ever seeing them return to broader relevance. They may be the last practitioners of Ulrican orthodoxy, maintaining forms that will die with them, preserving knowledge that will never again be valued or needed. The tragedy might be total and final, but the possibility of redemption exists precisely because they refuse to surrender to historical inevitability. As long as they persist, as long as even one Teutogen Guard draws breath and maintains his oaths, Ulric's truest form of worship remains alive in the world. And life, even marginal life, contains possibilities that death forecloses absolutely. The cosmic implication here touches on something approaching theological profundity. Perhaps the Teutogen Guard are experiencing what every faithful adherent to a declining religion must experience: the dark night of the soul, when God seems absent, when all the prayers appear unanswered, when faithfulness brings no reward except the continuation of faithfulness itself. In Christian mysticism, this is sometimes called the desert experience, the period when God withdraws all sense of his presence to test whether faith can survive without emotional consolation or material vindication. The Teutogen Guard are in Ulric's desert. Their God has not abandoned them. They still perform their rituals, still feel the cold burn of his power in winter's depth. But he has allowed them to become irrelevant, has not intervened to arrest their cult's decline, has let them suffer the anguish of watching everything they defend wither despite their perfect service. Why would Ulric permit this? If we take the theology seriously, if we treat this as more than mere political misfortune, but as something the God himself orchestrates or allows, what purpose could such suffering serve? Perhaps Ulric is testing whether his followers can maintain their devotion when devotion brings no advantage, when being strong does not lead to victory, when honor results in defeat. Perhaps the God values precisely this kind of pointless faithfulness because it proves the faithfulness is genuine rather than transactional. His worshippers serve him not because service brings rewards, but because they genuinely believe in what he represents. The Teutogen Guard's suffering becomes, in this interpretation, the crucible through which authentic faith is refined and revealed. Or perhaps, and this is darker, Ulric has indeed abandoned them, or at least values their suffering less than they imagine. Perhaps the God of winter and wolves cares nothing for institutional preservation, sees the decline of his organized cult as irrelevant to his actual nature. Ulric existed before the cult and would continue existing after it. The Teutogen Guard's agony matters to them, but why should it matter to a deity who is fundamentally indifferent to human projects and institutions? This interpretation transforms their loyalty from virtue into delusion. They suffer for a God who does not notice or care about their suffering, maintaining standards he has not asked them to maintain, guarding a faith he has already decided to let die. The Teutogen Guard cannot know which interpretation is true. They stand in theological darkness, required to choose between faith and despair, without clear evidence for either choice. And they choose faith, not confidently perhaps, not without doubt or anguish, but they choose it nonetheless, day after day, watch after watch, winter after winter. This is the ultimate revelation. The Teutogen Guard are not important because of what they achieve, but because of what they embody. The raw human capacity to continue serving ideals that offer no promise of vindication, to maintain discipline when discipline seems futile, to guard what may already be lost simply because the guarding itself is worth doing regardless of outcome. They are the Empire's last authentic warriors in a world that no longer values authentic warfare, preferring instead the efficient brutality of gunpowder and the strategic coldness of calculated violence. They are the final practitioners of a theology that demands everything and promises nothing except that your suffering will have meaning, even if you never understand what that meaning is. They are guardians of an absent God, or perhaps guardians of a God whose presence manifests precisely through absence, who teaches through silence, who demands faith that requires no evidence because evidence would make it something less than faith. And so they stand watch in Middenheim, these magnificent doomed warriors, these keepers of flame that grows dimmer each year but refuses to extinguish completely. They train with weapons the world considers obsolete. They maintain standards the world considers archaic. They serve a cult that survives through compromises they themselves refuse to make. They are everything the pragmatists warned Ulric's faithful not to be: inflexible, unadaptable, wedded to principles that guarantee their irrelevance. And precisely because they are all these things, they preserve something that pragmatism by its very nature cannot preserve: the memory that there was once a different way, a harder way, a way that asked more of warriors and expected less reward, a way that made meaning through adherence to difficult standards rather than through achievement of comfortable outcomes. The Teutogen Guard will probably never matter in the way they once hoped to matter. They will not lead great crusades or determine imperial politics. They will not arrest the cult of Ulric's decline or restore ancient Ulrican dominance over the Empire's religious landscape. They have already lost those battles, and the losses are likely permanent. But they can do something else, something smaller, quieter, and perhaps ultimately more significant. They can prove that losing does not require surrender, that institutional failure does not necessitate personal betrayal of principle, that the world's verdict is not the final verdict, that as long as even one warrior maintains the watch, the thing being watched over has not entirely died. This is their true function, the purpose they serve whether they fully understand it or not. The Teutogen Guard are not guardians of the Ar-Ulric's body, though they perform that duty faithfully. They are not even guardians of the cult of Ulric's institutional existence, which persists through compromises they have no power to prevent. They are guardians of something more fundamental, the possibility that strength and honor might someday matter again, that courage might be valued over calculation, that Ulric's harsh truths might prove more durable than Sigmar's comfortable accommodations. As long as they exist, that possibility exists. The moment they surrender, the moment they accept that the world has changed too much for their kind of virtue to survive, that possibility dies with them, and so they cannot surrender. They can only stand and guard and wait, these last wolves of Ulric, howling defiance at a winter that shows no sign of ending. But this leaves us with one final, unanswerable question that haunts everything we have explored. If the Teutogen Guard are right, if their refusal to adapt, their stubborn maintenance of impossible standards, their willingness to become irrelevant rather than compromise. If all of this eventually proves to have been wisdom rather than foolishness, what does that say about the nature of truth itself? Does it mean that truth is independent of success, that being right matters even when rightness accomplishes nothing? Or does their vindication, should it ever come, merely prove that they were strategically patient where others were strategically hasty? That their inflexibility was itself a form of long-term calculation? And if we can never know the answer, if the Teutogen Guard must continue their vigil without ever learning whether their sacrifice means anything beyond the sacrifice itself, is that not the most profound test of faith any deity could devise to serve? Without hope of reward, without certainty of purpose, without even the consolation of knowing whether you are heroic or deluded. The Teutogen Guard cannot answer this question. They can only live it day by day in the cold halls of Middenheim, guarding what may already be gone,